This is IBM Museum. I'm back with my glasses on. It's a little bit busy behind me. I do even have an IBM Think Center opened up to replace the fan on the power supply. I've got bunches of 80 millimeter fans that are 25 millimeters thick. But until I got into it, I had to find out that the fan is 20 millimeter thick, and you've got to realize how hard it is to find a 20 millimeter fan. I went through hundreds of listings, found mostly 25 millimeter thick. I found a few that were just 10 millimeters. Unfortunately, I can't stack them like that. And found one listing of a 20 millimeter, and I bought the last one on the listing there, and then that was out of stock. So I would have normally bought at least a second one or something else just to be prepared for opening up these units. I have a couple more Think Centers actually that are in that form factor as well, with probably close to that power supply. But anyhow, with all that business back on my bench there, I thought I'd go through a little bit of a topic that I've had online before. In fact, I've got the text of a post that I did on Facebook. And of course, I had to go through and I dropped that into a Google Doc, shared it to the world, just to be able to pull it up in the browser capture window with OBS. But I'll probably lead in a little bit with just reading through that text. I mean, and having it up, allowing others to kind of read through as well. I did phrase it that way, and I'd like to keep my saying it on track, so I don't run out of words just ad-libbing like this as well, and give you the treatment. So let's start reading through. I'm going to switch to a couple screens of another few pages. I've got up some information out there that's related to this as well. Hopefully I can explain the aspect in completeness. And by all means, I accept follow-up comments and people providing more information. I'll try and be as complete as I can. I also don't want to drift into that too long territory, which I'm already starting on. But let's begin. So this is a Facebook post I made. And the interesting thing was I made it to a group that's got thousands of members. And there was ultimately 10 comments back to my original post, but 7 of those comments were from me. The 3 authors that had responded, unfortunately, one was me, and it was 2 other people that responded. I mean, it was well-liked post, but I don't know if it was just, I thought it interesting. I don't know if it was just a little bit too in-depth for most people's taste or what exactly, but I talk about banging on the bits and, hitting on that hardware for getting values back, mainly in processor detection and things like that. And this is a very helpful thing. So let me just start reading and kind of hopefully not try and fill in too much as I go through and just read the text. It is very complete. So I sometimes hear that a CPUID can only be run starting from later 486 CPUs or Pentiums. Members in this group, and I'm referring to the Facebook group, are typically better informed and have run these processes themselves or heard about them. We are ultimately referring to what Intel called the CPU reset signature that they put in place before the 386 class CPUs were split into separate DX and SX categories! Exclamation point. This is a something Intel put in when they first came out with the 80386 processor. What became the 386DX, and of course all the bugs and everything else that initially came in with that processor design, but it was a leap forward from the 286 to the 386 CPU. And the fully 32-bit CPU, finally. 32-bit addressing, 32-bit data lines. Potential for accessing 4 gigabytes of RAM. We still see that out there today for that level of what that did. But so let's not deviate too much. When an Intel and later manufacturers followed the convention, 386 or later CPU has power supplied or initializes, it has a reset signature of its class or family level, also including a stepping encoding in the DX register. And the DX register is just a one of the general purpose registers of a x86 CPU. You have the AX, BX, CX, DX, gain into the EX registers. And those do particular things in the grand scheme of how Intel designed them. And that began with, that 8086 level stuff too. I mean, they have the same equivalent registers on that as well. There's also a segment register as well. But, or that's at EX, excuse me. But the DX register is just, as I say, it's a general purpose register. When the CPU starts up, it puts a value. It's hard coded into that CPU designed to report to tell what version level it is. And that's starting from those 386 CPUs. A PC BIOS has to quickly save that value away if it's to be available later. In fact, this is some of the initial code executed in BIOS on the systems that do this process. In my experience, all IBM PS2 BIOSes do. I've also observed it on Phoenix written BIOSes, but not AMI or award versions. So just some of the different BIOS writers out there. Phoenix was a very big name. AMI and Award were also very big names as well in kind of the clone side. But I'm just saying that all the IBM PS2 models support saving away that CPU reset signature in their BIOS. That's what the system does in BIOS, often for one of the very first tests once that system is powered on, before it even runs through the post test, testing all the components and everything else, saves away that DX register value for later on. Okay. This is because the function is typically tied to the presence of an extended CMOS area on the motherboard or planar, and not truly needed for the operation of the computer or operating system. And what I mean there is IBM introduced with the PS2 line the concept of an ABIOS, and it also had an extended CMOS area with those microchannel systems. And so that was even the later PS2s that were based on the 386 and above PS2s that were based on the ISA bus do this save away to that extended CMOS area. They have that extended CMOS area even though they're not microchannel systems, as well as, it introduces that trivia as well that I've spoken on videos before. IBM did not have a 386DX level CPU that powered an ISA bus PS2. And for all intents and purposes, later, the value points, Aptivas, PS1s, all that. IBM did not produce or did not have a CPU that was a 386DX related CPU that was put on an ISA bus PS2 system, or any system, even the earlier ones, since that ended with the AT levels and all that at the 286 level. And also what that means too is the clone BIOS manufacturers, AMI and Award, didn't really use that value because they didn't have necessarily extended CMOS area on their systems that they had BIOSes for. And really, in the grand scheme of things, that CPU reset was viewed as it's not a critical function. It's not critical for the system to absolutely know what stepping level of CPU that it's running on. Just that it's running. And some determination of that, what code it supports, can be done later and easily enough in software. So since that value was not a critical aspect, other manufacturers didn't necessarily follow suit in that. The CPU reset signature is placed in the extended CMOS registers 190 hex, and I have parens for the family or class, i.e. a 03 for a 386DX and 04 for 486. The 386SX has the same bus width as a 286 level, so it is a value of 23. And I'm kind of speculating in that regard. I'm saying, or how that value was of 23 was derived, but it makes sense in a way. It's a half step between a 386SX is a half step between a 286 and a 386DX. So it kind of makes sense on that. And 191 hex parens the stepping and model information. So Intel, and we're talking about the Intel convention and what they used. And it's also important to note, I think I get into it a little bit later on. Yeah, I do. We'll cover that when I get to that. I don't want to just get too long here. Of course, there could be a program written to change or corrupt these values for later checks, but I'm not aware of anything that does. But it's part of my due diligence to tell people that it could be corrupted. May have to get a drink here. You'll see me drinking on video, but not beer, but Powerade. So what that means is that it's saving those contents to a memory area, basically. And there could be something done. Somebody could go in there and they could change those values. I have a program that would go in there and change that around and modify those to make it give an incorrect result that's not really truly the CPU reset signature. But I'm not aware of anything that necessarily does that. I'm just aware of some of the processes that read that CPU reset. And it's important to note, I mean, the programs that are doing that or the even an interrupt call that's doing that is reading that memory location. It's not otherwise able to determine that CPU reset is necessarily authentic because the CPU has already moved on, that the contents of that DX register have been overwritten by all the stuff that the computer has done later on. So, okay. In 1992, and except for the 46SL, there's always exceptions, Intel introduced the ability to gain the same CPU reset signature, with one exception, read below, which you will, during operation. This is directly from the CPU and is not a value otherwise stored by the BIOS. Intel primarily did this to add a 12-byte CPU vendor string. In their instance, genuine Intel. So that's a string. And so other CPU vendors were, of course, mimicking the relevant Intel reset signature in their products. Operating system started to show the vendor string where the CPU was identified. What that means is, and there were times when AMD was licensed by Intel to produce, in particular, the 8088 CPU for the IBM XT and other clones out there. But you'll find AMD CPUs, 8088s on IBM XTs. Those are fully licensed by Intel. The 286 level, AMD produced 286 CPUs to help Intel out as well. The 386 level, well, there's some things that changed that relationship, and Intel decided to kind of clamp down when they were releasing that flagship of a 386 CPU, being as a change, as big a change as it was. Decided to kind of lock down the license a little bit more. I do have examples of what's called the IBM Silver Cap, ultimately a 386DX CPU that IBM put in their packaging. And what they mean is that I think we've seen the sugar cube, so-called sugar cube memory with Mol 80, but that aluminum cover over just a hermetic seal of pins. And it's the same pinout as the Intel 386DX. If you go through and read the reset signature, it actually shows up as an Intel code mask on that CPU. It for all intents and purposes, it's an Intel inside. And IBM was just going through and helping Intel with the production levels, with all the other licensing agreement changes and who they're partnering with. They needed some help in some areas as well. And you'll find those silver cap CPUs on Model 70s and Model 80s out there. And I say for one instance, it's been the only particular CPU that I've discovered has been on those silver caps, the 0304 stepping. I've only seen that silver cap. I've never seen that in the Intel version. But if you search on the internet for silver caps altogether, SILVERCAPS, you'll probably find some posts from me at earlier times of commenting on that aspect, or you'll find maybe some links that I referenced, information I put out there on what those CPUs actually look like. I could maybe put some video. If there's enough interest, I can probably cover those, and I can have a nice, beautiful picture, just like we have on the Intel Overdrive down there. And that'll come in handy later on. And what this also, I probably should break into the reading of the text and make this a little bit longer. What this also means is you'll find a 46 CPU, and we'll cover this later as well, that will have a copyright date of just the 89, meaning 1989, and no later copyright date. And that CPU does not have that last paragraph I read. It's not able to do in a sense, an on-the-fly CPUID that of what Intel added in 1992. And if it has a later date, like 1992 or 1993, like that picture does of that Overdrive CPU that's right below me, then it supports that on-the-fly CPUID. And again, we'll cover that with another web page a little bit later on as well. Intel also had specific CPUs that changed their CPUID values depending on how the onboard L1 cache, should be a word that's in there, was configured, either in write back or write through modes. And all that means is just a brief overview of the L1 cache is a very quick memory area next to the registers of the CPU, or the quickest acting. but that L1 cache being just the code that's basically the CPU is going to work on, those cache lines, as it's called, of that code that's coming in, basically. And that's on the CPU die itself. That's the closest cache to the CPU is called the L1 or the level 1 cache. And typically L2 cache is off CPU, in particular with early models of CPUs. And we're talking about the 386 DX level, the 46 DX level. That L2 cache is off the CPU board. It's faster memory than the regular system RAM because it's a little bit bigger than the L2 cache, but it's, L2 cache is slower than the L1 cache that's on the CPU. But it's there to assist with the CPU performance. I'm sure I can get lots of comments of people that follow up on my brief description of cache to give a little bit more indication on how it can work. In some cases, may not work so well, or the cache lines need to be flushed or whatever. But so what I'm meaning there, this is the exception that the reset signature would match a later on-the-fly value from the CPUID instructions. Certain Intel 46DX2 CPUs are CPUID 0436 when in L1 cache write-back mode, and 0470 hex when the L1 cache is set as write-through, or WT. Is more common with 46DX4 100 CPUs to be CPUID 0483 hex in write-back and 0490 in L1 cache write-through mode. And this overdrive CPU that's below me doesn't have that, but I'll show you a chart. The page is coming up of how to determine that as well. What can be helpful in kind of determining those things. But I'm using the example that that reset signature that was initially gained and stored away in memory in that CMOS extended CMOS area can differ from the on-the-fly in that the CPU starts up typically with that cache in a basic mode, or the most basic mode that may change later on. And just informing people with this post I made that the CPU can change that CPU ID that's reported later on based on that cache mode or the L1 cache mode that it is set as. And that's just on a few CPUs. I have them in a chart that's going to be shown later on. And I've actually been recently corrected on this. I should kind of write this out. There are certain systems, BIOSes, that only function with specific CPUID values. The IBM type N complex. N is this IBM submodel encoding to mean a 46DX266. Only runs with CPU IDs of 041X hex or 043X hex. Since it's a function from BIOS, it's not easily bypassed. You are thinking of upgrading, even if it fits in the available space, your model 9595 into a Kingston or Trinity works that we saw the CPUs with the NCR system. We also saw the CPU that's pictured below me, and that was the CPU that was in that NCR system until I went through and replaced it with a model that's a little bit shorter, runs a little bit faster CPU. And if you want to review that, you can always look at that NCR video for the 3220 just a few days ago, as it ultimately was with the production schedule I'm doing for videos right now. And as I say, that information is incorrect. There's other factors for the CPUs that were put in there and how that complex, and that's the card, the CPU, and sometimes cache on the card, or a card and daughter card, and that's called a complex in the parlance of. And that's your Model 90s and your Model 95s, PS2s, that typically had 486 class CPU getting into the Pentiums for those, what's called a Type 4 complex. And the N was the lowest level of that complex for a Type 4 T4. But you can just erase that information from your mind because there's other factors there than what I wrote at the time. Here is a page I've compiled data for showing the different reset signatures that can be returned from an interrupt call present on at least IBM PS2s, or if you like, how to read the extended CMOS registers 0190 hex and 0191 hex from ROM Basic. And I on the post I had the link, and I'll actually bring that up next, of how software can be written to check what that CPU reset signature is. So let me pause the video at this point and get that web page up on the screen. Okay, and here is that web page. So this is actually on my site. It's mirrored in other places as well, and we'll talk about that with the next web page that I have for showing this. But this is a BIOS interrupt call, and it's interrupt 15 hex, function C9 hex. There's a listing of BIOS calls, and I do have of the root page for this, and I'll provide this link. I do have some of those interrupt calls fleshed out. I need to go through and update the information. Mainly what I'm trying to do is reproduce the interrupt function calls that are relative to the IBM systems and PS2s in particular. I'm not really interested in sometimes of the clone BIOS stuff or whatever, stuff like that mimicked the IBM systems. And a lot of time, the clone systems out there, as I said earlier, they just don't support getting that CPU reset. They don't have an extended CMOS area to even store that value away. So they don't have that function call in there. And this isn't a really typical layout that you'll see online. And probably the biggest name that's kind of known is Ralph Brown. And he did some books in that Andrew Schulman series that I've talked about. And I think I've shown there's a related book called PC Interrupts. And that's written by that Ralph Brown and Jim Kyle. And I've gone over that on previous videos, showing that white cover. I think I probably even provided the ISBN identification for that as well. So that's been replicated on the internet as the Ralph Brown interrupt list, RBIL. So you see reference to RBIL. That's what that means, Ralph Brown interrupt list. But this is a basic format of how things are shown, that you have the registers that call, what values you plug in to those registers before you call the interrupt. And then it returns values in the registers based on the results of that system. So I'm saying the registers that call are the AH register, and that's the high side of the AX register, the high order bits, contains the value of C9 hex. And that is the function that you're trying to call, and then you say you put that value in there and you issue interrupt 15 hex, and that's completing your functions. And then it's giving return registers. CF is carry flag. Carry flag is set on error, and that's just a little flag bit value basically on the CPU as well, in addition to the registers. That the carry flag is used in some of the CPU operations. So if you see it set on error, meaning it's a 1, or you get a return of 1 after you do the interrupt call, you know the interrupt call failed. You would see that on a clone BIOS. If it succeeds, if you have relevant results, that carry flag is clear. It's a 0. So that gives you a quick indication right off if that is supported. We've gone over earlier over that that BIOS string, and I also have that up there. And in particular, in the SIT demonstrations I've done of the various systems, that CPU supports CPU function calls. No, that's controlling the cache and things like that. But there's ways to determine whether this function is supported as well, or even deeper functions of the CPU that it has on the system. And so the return registers, AH is the status, and if it fails again, AH may be, either 80 hex or 86 hex for a main function not supported. But otherwise, if your carry flag is clear, it's a 0. You have the AH is 00. The CH register, and that's just the high order bytes of the CX register, another register on the system, has a CPU family, and that's where I was talking about that 03, 04, or 23 in there. And I've got that detail below. And then the CL, and that's the low order bits of that CX register. And it explains in there, CH equals 03 mean a 386DX, or 23X means it's a 386SX. Then the CL register is the stepping value of that CPU. Otherwise, the 4 highest order bits are the CPU model, lowest order of the CPU stepping reference. And we get into that below. So in this table, and as I say table of CPU family values, note these are only Intel and AMD values. AMD, Cyrix, and other CPU manufacturers have other stepping information. And sometimes they mimicked what the Intel CPUs did for good reason. Sometimes they had their own values later on when they derived their own CPUs, reverse engineered their own CPUs, including Intel. They changed, those to what they thought were relevant values. I think in a follow-up comment that I did on that initial page, that initial Facebook post, one of my comments of the 7 for the 10 total comments that I did, talked about the Cyrix CPUs have other ways to determine the processor level, what that processor says it is, and that's the DIR0 and DIR1 instructions that basically those Cyrix CPUs do for a lot of the same functionality as well. Just their own little way of doing things. And so in the table, I have when CH equals 03, meaning a 386DX class CPU, CL equal to 00 is that A step, and that was a very buggy CPU. There were some things that, Intel had a number of bugs. For that big of leap forward, you you have some stumbles as well. And they went through and fixed those bugs in the later stepping versions. That's what stepping does. It just gets rid of bugs and makes that CPU perform a little bit better, or not have problems in certain area that would be called errata. The details to what caused an error and how, to go through and fix whatever bug that was and how it happened to occur. If CL equals 0.3, it's the B1 step, starting to get a little bit more stable. CL equals 0.4 is the C step, and that's the variant that I've only seen in a silver cap. I've never seen that in an Intel 386 DX CPU. I've never found that C step otherwise, and I've tested a lot of CPUs. Not as many 386 DX CPUs as I've tested 486 DX. I've tested a bunch of those, and I have a drawer full of many I tested, and some are back installed on systems as well. So, that NCR system where I worked, what I called the Intel fork, to unseat that CPU out of the socket, I've done that operation many times. I've eaten with that fork, so to speak, or digested information from going through and popping one CPU out of there and putting another one in. I didn't have always the convenience by any means of those zero insertion force ZIF sockets. I had PGA sockets that, and of course you can't just pull a 386 SX off the planer sometimes. I just had to test mini boards that had 386 SX CPUs. And the stepping for those comes in place later on too. CL05 is a D0 step. CL08, which is C quite a bit of, is that D1, D2, E1, or F0 step, meaning that Intel was just generically classifying those as CPUIDs and had gone through and ironed out most of the bugs out of the 386DX at that point. If CH equals 0.4 hex, it's a 46 class. And CL 0x hex, and what I'm doing here, and this will be a little bit more evident for the 46 class. I doubt if I'll go through. Let's save some time. We're almost close to 40 minutes anyway. I will probably save some time reading. You can pause the video, certainly, to look over the information, but that's just breaking up the 46 class CPUs from Intel into particular encodings of the stepping and things like that, or what CPU type they were. Because you had the regular 46DX that weren't, they weren't clock multiplied internally. You had the 46DX2s that were clock multiplied by 2 inside, the DX4s that were clock tripled internally. You had the 486SX without the math coprocessor. That's the difference between the 46SX, a tongue twister, and 46DX is that where that math coprocessor is on board that chip or not. And there's all kinds of stories. We can probably get a comment on the video on how some of that what is a 47 processor, that upgrade that you can put in there when it has the encoding for being a math coprocessor on it, 487. So let's scroll kind of through that. And like I say, a lot of time you can review that and read, and that denotes even the 8 kilobyte right through L1 cache. It has all kinds of little steppings, and the next webpage I'll get into is much more detailed. That webpage will also be linked in the video description. So And we get into some of those where I talk about when the CPU is in one mode, it reports a certain CPU ID, and when it's in another mode. So you can even determine what mode that L1 cache is in by that CPU ID as well. I mean, on the fly, the processors that have that functionality report the CPU ID on the fly anyway. So you're not going to get that from that reset signature location. You're going to get it with issuing the CPUID instruction. And it's particular opcodes that you pass to do that. I don't know what that stuff is off the top of my head. But in their assembler, you can go through and create the values for that mnemonic. It gets late at night. I can't talk. You say, hooray, hooray. So we get up to, even for me saying CH equals 05, Pentium class, right in the middle of that page, many variants. So I don't go over all there's so many variants that I don't even attempt. Intel started to come into where they were, that CPU ID string really started to mean a little bit more, and it told about the capabilities of what that chip did for the Pentium level. CH equals 14, and I think we were seeing that the other day with the NCR system, the 46 class overdrives. And an overdrive CPU may or may not plug in, have that 14 value instead of the 04 value. But if they do, they're reporting themselves as an overdrive, just like that CPU I have pictured over here on the right underneath me on the right. So the CH equals 15 hex is the Pentium class 486 overdrives, what's called the POD. POD 6.3 and POD 8.3, and that's the 6.3 and 8.3 is meaning the internal clock frequencies, and that's a multiplier of 2.5. Wrap your head around that. It takes the 33 megahertz speed and multiplies it times 2.5 for the internal frequency, or takes that 25 megahertz frequency and multiplies it times 2.5 for the 63 megahertz. And I listed there, the CL equals 31 is 63 megahertz pod step B1 or B2. CL equals 32 is 63 or 83 megahertz pod step C0. And these are just the samples that I've gone through and ran through so many CPUs through this process to get those values for this table. Okay, we get on to the CH equals 23 hex is a 36X SX class. And initially, it has the CL equals 04 hex is the A0 step. So initially with the 386 SX, since it's soldered to the motherboard or to the planar that's on, you can't often do a CPU replacement. You can add in a CPU. They had the so-called clip-over CPU upgrades that went through and basically just attached or alien parasite over the top of the 386 6SX to take over the processor functions, and that the pin, I think it's pin 1, I may be mixing up, but it was called the float pin, and that was on later 386 6SX to disable the 386 386SX so that another processor could assume those processing functions. And the initial versions of the 386 6SX, you're going to love me going through that. Hopefully I don't have to say that more times. Didn't have that float pin. Is all that means. Long story short. And then I get into where the B step, the C step, and a lot of time I'll relate on the like the PS2 Mul 55SX of having a particular level of that 386SX on there that's a level that can be disabled and things like that on the later planar, the Type 2 planar. Just like I say, hopefully I won't go through that tongue twister anymore. My mouth's shutting down maybe. So then I touch on the IBM CPUs that you can see out there, and those are derived separately. They were licensed by Intel and allowed to modify, the CPU cores to what they wanted to do. And that's interesting how that licensing was viewed and what they did with that. And they did create some really good CPUs in the cases of those 486-6. So it's even dropping over to the 46s now. 46 SLC2 and the 46 SLC3. And I talk about here the CH equals A3, and IBM put that A value in there to show that they were the vendor for that CPU pretty early on with their derived CPUs. I only know of one variant of the IBM 386 SLC CPU. And then they have there's the variants of the 46 SLC class, what those, and IBM used there the CL register, that 2.1 or 2.2, and then for the 46 SLC2, and that leading 2 means the internal clock multiplier of that chip, and therefore CL equals 39 hex. The last entry I have there is for a 486 SLC3. That lean 3 means that it's a clock tripled internally. And so I'm having the notes, the BIOS must save DX at startup in order to support this call. PS2 BIOSes merely read the extended CMOS locations at offset 190 hex and 191 hex. And I'm talking about that CPU reset, that reset signature value has to be saved away to that extended CMOS location, and this function call is just retrieving that value from those locations. I even have how to get those values from ROM Basic. You get that Model 80 planar that's laid out, no drives connected, powered up. You can do these, drops into ROM Basic. You can do these calls, these functions from that ROM Basic. And if you don't have any line numbers and you're not typing up a program on there in, basically with line numbers to execute at a particular point, you just type these in as I have them listed, and you'll get back the those values of what is contained in that extended CMOS register. And I tell you how to do it for the CPU class and the CPU stepping value. So that's a way to do it, like I say, without a system otherwise that really has any drives or an operating system running. All code is with the assumption that the extended CMOS at offsets 0190 hex and 0191 hex have been unmolested since booting the system. That there's been no program or nothing else that's gone in there and written a value that overwrites the what was contained in that register from the CPU doing that reset signature, putting those values in there, the BIOS putting those values in there. Supported models. And I did update this in November of 2020. And basically to go through, and if it's an IBM PS2, and it has to be a 386 SX. Is that going to be the last time I have to say that? The term of that CPU. has to be that minimum level. It can't be a 286 or the lower, an 8086 CPU. Those don't have a CPU reset signature that was done by Intel at that level, starting with the 386DX. So it really, for all the supported models, that means that that anything PS2 does it. And I've gone through and I've tested that on PS2s. And then I have at the bottom, I have that link back to the interrupts index. I think that works. Yeah, it does. And like I say, you can click on this. I've fleshed some of these out. Other ones, I don't have any details. And sometimes you even get a 404 error for the page that I don't have populated at all. But, and see, it's got that in purple instead of blue for the get CPU type and mask revision. But some of the other things, as we've seen in that, going over that system information tool, you can see in here about the, where's some of the other ones? And I mean, that system information tool is mainly operating from that Git configuration value. And I don't know if I've shown that on, I've just started doing this browser capture rather recently, but you guys can go through and look at that. That's the stuff that the system information tool retrieves to determine if, hey, it's a microchannel bus, it's a dual bus system, and even that interrupt 15 function C8. Okay, so I meant to look at that, and that's the enable disable CPU functions, not necessarily that get. Okay, yeah, like I say, you get 404 errors. But it's time to go through. You guys can look over that interrupt page and go through. It's time to pull up let me pause the video again, pull up that last page I want to go over, and we'll talk about that picture below me of that overdrive CPU and what some of the markings are. Hopefully we'll get under an hour of recording time, but I'm quickly coming on that. Okay, and I'm not going to go over a lot of the tabled information, and I probably need to do a little bit of a rewrite just to make sure I've got all the data here absolutely correct or presented in the best way. And I've covered some of this material before. I'm not necessarily going to read through, but this is relating specifically to the Intel 486 class processors and the Pentium Overdrive, those Pentium Overdrive 63 megahertz and Pentium Overdrive 83 megahertz that plug into that kind of that standard socket. It's got an outer row of pins from what a 386DX, a 386 class CPU normally plugs into in the socket. And sometimes you get into the zero insertion force sockets when you get up to what's able to handle those Pentium Overdrive systems. And that basically just puts in a Pentium level processor into your 486 system. And don't worry, it doesn't have the F-divide bug on those Pentium Overdrive CPUs for the 486. Now, I talked earlier on this page, and I don't want to say an irritation, but this page, people have copied this page. You find this information out on the internet now, and they don't. A lot of times I don't see credit for it to me of where they captured that information from, and a lot of times more irritating, I guess to say, is they have an outdated version of the page that they've captured. They're not sourcing from the page that I update on my site. And there are authorized mirrors of this information. The Ardent tool that I link in from my pages, it's a colleague of mine. It's a trusted person of mine that I know that gives me credit. He's done so many times. I give him credit for the wizard that he is too. He finds a lot of things. He's has a very competent person and knows in a lot of areas more than I do. So that's why I correspond with him and go through and, really love to present his material and have him hosting in the cases of some of my content. But this goes over some of the just the earlier areas that I talked about. I'll include this link in there, but covers those that 46 class and what you get for a reset signature, or in the cases of where you may get that processor may be capable of the on-the-fly CPUID, or they can the encode. They can go through and at any point in the operating system, they don't have to retrieve that CPU reset value from CMOS memory. They're just able to query the CPU. Hey, what is your reset signature? What does that look like? Even if that cache state is changed as well. And I talk about, a lot of the other producers of CPUs tried to mimic the Intel. They tried to make their CPUs look to the system like it was an Intel system as well. And that's why Intel created that vendor string to tell their CPUs differently than others. That you could say, I am running on a genuine Intel, and I got that Intel Inside sticker on my system case. That means it's running an Intel CPU. Going over that, and I get down at this point, the Intel S-spec notation. And I talk about, in some cases, IBM went through and rebranded the Intel produced CPUs. In other words, there's not Intel markings on it. They're given copyright dates, copyright Intel, and then particular dates. But they're marked with an IBM FRU, knowing for, in a sense, a replacement level part of what an IBM system would need, marked in that method rather than an S-spec, even though it's an Intel CPU otherwise. So the S-spec is a 5-character marked in the form of a capital S, as in Steve, uppercase letter, usually an X on the 46 CPUs, and then it has 3 digits following. And that can be a capital X for that second character, can be a U, can be a Z. You commonly see on, and I'm talking about just relating to, even though IBM has continued that S-spec listing, and they had that as early as the 386 DX, and promised the last time 386 SX CPUs were often marked during the production levels later on, as those processors were stabilized. They were marked with an S-spec as well. And the thought is that it's just a batch version marking by Intel. And there can be CPUs that have a different S-spec, yet be the same code mask and everything else internally. Intel may have meant for where the CPU was produced as a difference of that S-spec. And, but on the CPU that's shown below me, we're interested in the S-spec in this case is that SZ957 is the S-spec of that CPU. So kind of what you're looking for now, or when you see that S-spec marked on an Intel CPU, that's the S-spec value. And I do go through on, and I think for time matters, you can read some of the this page later on about the stepping values and things like that. But I've gone through the chart, and this is a lot of gleaned information over time tested many CPUs, and some of the things I have is marked as unknown. And you're welcome to contact me through comments and saying, I've gone through and I've had the CPU, I've tested it, and it gives me a CPU ID of this. It's marked with the copyright date of this. I think I got to most of the updates that I was supposed to, that CPUs I always learned or could update on this table. But there may be some that have just slipped past me. So certainly if you have something listed as unknown, fill me in, give me a little bit of information. And it lists the CPU ID that it reports, and that's at CPU reset, to be clear, because in these initial 46 class CPUs, they could be where they don't support that on the fly or OTF, and I have that listed as no for that column. And that on the fly, that's my own terminology, I guess, or I don't know how to say it simpler, but that CPU ID could be supplied later on in the operating process by the operating system or whatever else. And as I say, in some of the systems, you got into Windows 95 in particular, you looked in the information of that computer, did properties of my computer, you would see that marking in there of the, of marking what that CPU was. So the operating system started to show what the processor was on that system, in addition to the RAM memory as well, of course. And I say what processor it is, whether it's a 46DX, 46SX, a 46DX2, going down through this chart, what the S-spec that's printed on that, and generally that's on the top of the CPU, the marking, the silkscreen marking, and it may be under a heat sink that's glued on there or something else, as well. So there's things, and I've handled a lot of 46s to come up with this chart. If there's a copyright date, it's listed on the CPU. And as I say, you have something before 1992, it doesn't support that on the fly. If it's 89 or the 90 copyright dates, the stepping value when I knew it, and as I say in the text above that, I don't know the reasons, or that's the most complete information I can come out with. Intel has been rather tight-lipped about what those stepping values meant, even though later on they revealed a little bit more. On the 386DX, they actually revealed a little bit more information as far as what that stepping meant and some of the bugs that would be on particular versions of particular steppings of that CPU, and what they had quashed away as well. And then any notes, if there's markings on there, or if I found an IBM FRU code, field replacement unit, for that CPU or not, that didn't have an S-spec on it, is marked. And then, Intel went through and that SL enhanced, it's just working through and optimizing the core for the processor core for power levels and things like that, and performance. So I have those marked. And as we go through this chart, you'll have the link. You can scroll through it as well. We get to, and I just wanted to, if you find. So let's kind of put it in the middle of the screen. I guess I got some more. Do I have less or more scrolling to do? I'm getting into the SC95 whatever. Okay, there I go. I'll put it on kind of the middle of the screen. Okay, or it's up above the kind of the middle of the screen here. I've got that SZ957, just like that picture over to the right hand side shows on top of that CPU. And IBM, Intel used sequential S-spec numbering sometimes in those. You'll see a kind of a pattern in there sometimes. But then over on the right, I've listed, some of the things of what's printed on the CPU, what stepping level. There's even mobile CPUs that are in here, different packages. Sometimes I went through, if I marked it as a plastic quad flat pack, which you'll see with the 46 SL or 46SX, it'll be in that package, but most otherwise they're in that pin grid array format. There is some even DX4 CPUs that Intel also had in that plastic quad flat pack packaging. And then even some marking if normally they were 5 volt, but then there are some later productions of 3 volt CPUs where you need a voltage regulator. And then I have on the chart identified any of the CPUID when it changes that CPUID for the particular cache modes. And just that last updated date. But that is a reference. We've gone over an hour. I'll go through and I didn't try and be that long, but I ramble. So I'll have the links in the video description so you can pull up these pages on yourself, look through the material. If it interests you, great. I like to see comments and things like that. That was the topic for tonight's video. We cover just a wide variety of content, not necessarily relating to the IBM in a way, but IBM supporting that function call to allow to gain that CPU reset signature, at an earlier time before that on-the-fly CPUID existed. So I just want to put out the information of how that could. And that was the notion of my Facebook post, to say, hey, you can do this. You can get this information. You don't have to wait for that on-the-fly CPUID. As long as you have an IBM PS2 system, you can figure it out. So, very off-the-wall content. But if you like it, click on that like button, please. And always, I am open to feedback and just telling me, hey, you just ramble on, you're too long, you're covering these subjects. Takes me an hour of my day to just watch your video. More time of scrolling through these pages that you link. But give me that feedback for whatever it's worth, because it lets me know that you're listening, and I'll see what I can respond from there. But that's all I have for now. This is IBM Museum. Thank you.